So today we are speaking with Terri Givens about bridging racial divides through radical empathy. Welcome, Terri.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here and to talk to you today.
Yeah, me too. I'm just going to say a couple things and then we'll jump into the conversation. So on screen, we do have two ASL interpreters and they'll be tag teaming, so you'll see them come on and off the screen. Our ASL interpreters are sponsored by Interpreter Now, which is a deaf-owned company that has been an incredible partner for us. This is also being live captioned by Maggie at White Coat Captioning. So if you want to turn on captioning, go down to the bottom at closed caption. Use that button there, and you can change the size and other things there as well. And then our team, Juliet, Renzo, Sally, Araya, and Emily are all kind of behind the scenes doing stuff, including just monitoring the chat. So speaking of the chat, please do share what you're thinking about, share what you're learning, and let us know what's really resonating for you. And if you have any specific questions that you want to make sure we get to, use the Q&A function down at the bottom of your screen so we can find them easily. So today, I'm excited to have this conversation. I believe we need more empathy in the world, straight out. Like, I think that would change the world considerably. And so I have dedicated a lot of my life and my work to building empathy, and a lot of my inclusive leadership training and coaching has building empathy as its core. And my work is going deeper and deeper into that area. So I'm really excited to have this conversation and learn your thoughts, Terri, about empathy and how we deepen empathy so that we can really bridge the racial divides and really be there for each other in a deeper way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So well, let's start with you, a bit about you and who you are and how you got to be doing the work that you're doing and writing the book you just wrote that is coming out in a couple of days.
Yes, indeed. So I started out my career as a political scientist. I did my undergrad at Stanford, first generation, and I'm the youngest of 7. And that plays a big role in the writing of my book, but as well as the fact that I grew up in a place called Spokane, Washington, which is an Eastern Washington state and is not the most diverse place in the world. So, I started out there because that's where I was as the youngest. My dad was at the end of his military career, and that's where we landed, and that's where he retired. So I grew up, I was born and raised there for the most part. We lived briefly in upstate Michigan, but other than that, I spent most of my growing up time in Spokane. And then, as I mentioned, went to Stanford undergrad, worked for a few years, and then I got my PhD at UCLA, and my first teaching job was at University of Washington. And I went on to University of Texas at Austin before becoming the provost at Menlo College here in the Bay Area. And so now I'm living in Menlo Park, California. But what motivated me to write this book was really trying to understand my own story and my family's story. And if you read the book, you'll know that I really focus on storytelling. And I think that's a really important component for empathy. And part of that has to do with the fact that I really believe you have to understand yourself before you can have empathy for others. And so when I was working on the book, I was digging into the family genealogy and trying to understand some of the decisions and choices my parents made. And in particular, the fact that they were coming from relatively low income backgrounds and were trying to create a more middle class lifestyle for us, and really didn't interact with a lot of other African American families in Spokane. And that had a big impact on my own understanding of myself as well as how I fit into the world. And so, we can talk more about that, but that's kind of the broader gist of it, is really the motivation. I lost both of my parents, and I was truly trying to understand their life story and how they made the different choices they made and how that impacted me throughout my life and my career.
Awesome. Well, let's start with start at the beginning. Well, first, let's start with, I don't think we actually said the name of your book. What's the name of your
book? It's called, well, here, I'll do better than that. I actually have a copy here. I always have to be prepared. So it's Radical Empathy, Finding a Path to Bridging Racial Divides. And it is officially coming out February 25th. So Thursday we're having our launch and all of that. But yeah, so the reason I talk about bridging racial divides is because the other motivation for this, of course, has been the events. And I've been thinking about this all of my life, but we had the major events really starting in 2016. And then this last summer with the protests and so on. And I was really trying to figure out, how do we get to this point where we can bridge racial divides? So that was really important to me.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, okay. So now let's start with kind of break it down. So
Yes.
First, let's start with radical empathy and the term radical.
Yes.
So I often say practice radical inclusion, which means by that, I mean, go beyond the basics, live and breathe inclusion, really go deep into thinking about it and embodying inclusion. So is that what you're saying with radical empathy? Okay.
Absolutely. So and we might as well dive into the 6 steps to radical empathy, because the first step is a willingness to be vulnerable. And so for me, that was all about diving in and really trying to understand who I am based on, my parents' choices, my own life choices, and really trying to dig deep, because the next step is becoming grounded in who you are. And when you become grounded in who you are, for me, it meant having confidence, having self-acceptance, and having empathy for myself. So I really emphasize the fact that you can't have empathy for others until you have empathy for yourself. And then the third step is opening yourself up to the experiences of others. So when you're grounded in yourself, then you're more willing to be open to understanding others' differences and so on. The fourth step is practicing empathy, because empathy doesn't come naturally really to any of us. We have to practice it, because especially because we're fighting against our kind of natural inclination to put people in categories and to divide people. And what we have to understand is that we have to be intentional. And in being intentional, we really are both opening ourselves up to other people, but also practicing empathy. So then the fourth step, which is the radical part, is taking action. And so it's one thing to have empathy and say, yes, I understand what you're feeling. I can put myself in your shoes. It's a whole other thing to take action. And I think that's been a big problem with a lot of the allyship I'm seeing, is people like, oh, yes, I understand. I've read the books. I've watched the movies, but what action are you taking? What are you doing? And it can be really simple. We can talk about some of that, because the sixth step is creating change and building trust. And the building trust component is really important, because people need to be able to trust in the fact that what we're doing is moving us forward, but also have trust in each other. And so for example, one of the most simple things, when I live in Menlo Park, California. It's a very expensive place, and unfortunately, it's not very diverse, as most people who know it know. But
it's from Spokane to Menlo Park.
Yeah, exactly. Well, you do what you got to do. And to be fair, the most important thing to me has always been living close to work, so this was really close to Menlo College. But I also think it's important that my neighbors have somebody like me. To live next to it. So if I can afford this neighborhood, it's important to have diversity. I'm bringing diversity to my neighborhood. But, the other thing I do is that when I'm talking to my neighbors, and, especially last summer, a lot of them were asking me, oh, Terri, what can we do? How can we create change? And I'm like, start with this neighborhood. Look around. Try to understand why it looks the way it does. Why are we the only Black family in, within us, at least a square mile, and what are the so this brings us to the whole idea of structural racism, which is the fact that my neighbors are not racist. And yet we live in structures that have led this neighborhood to be very segregated. The minorities and other people live on the other side of 101, and we live over here. And so it's really important to understand that even though you may not be racist, you are being impacted, and not just white people. Every single one of us is being impacted by structural racism. And so we have to be, that's why I come back to the word intentionality over and over and over again, because we have to be intentional to work past that structural racism.
Yeah. And I want to focus on empathy and the bridging the racial divides. And I also think it is important that so many of us grow up thinking that, we live on opposite sides of the highway because of, just our jobs and because of, culture. But that's, it's a lot deeper than that. And the structural things that have happened for generations around redlining and the real estate market. And it's still happening in different ways, where people are not able to get to move, have upward mobility or to lateral mobility even.
Yeah, you may have seen that article. I think it was in Marin City, where this couple put, they'd done a ton of remodeling to their house, and they got it appraised, and they thought, wow, this appraisal is really low. So they had a white friend, they were a Black couple, they had a white friend come in and do the be there while the appraiser was there, and they increased the appraisal by $400,000.
Oh.
And this is right here in Marin. So, we talk, people think California is progressive, but, it's all the same problems. And believe me, I work with a lot of community organizations, and, we're still dealing with the same problems that the rest of the country is dealing with in terms of divides and the structural issues, from education to housing. I mean, I highly recommend the book, The Color of Law. I'll drop that in here because it really explains how different things impacted just the housing patterns here in the San Francisco Bay Area. And we did some workshops around that, and people just, people just have to wake up to the fact that these things didn't just happen because of merit or, I'm smarter than you. It's all been designed into the system by, the fact that we created these laws in the past that have kept people divided.
Yeah. And those systems were designed a long time ago and never redesigned. Right. And that's right. The work that we all have to do, right? That's the structural deconstructing and then reconstructing. Okay, so how do you okay, so let me kind of go through the six steps again. So it's a willingness to be vulnerable, becoming grounded in who you are, opening yourself up to the experiences of others, practicing empathy, taking action, and then creating change and building trust.
Right.
Maybe my next question is, in your book, well, you described your book to me as part memoir and part academic, part.
Yes. It brings together all my different sides, activist, academic,
and that's memoir. Great. That's what makes a great book. And you write about your father's death and how that kind of catalyzed you into and really led you to an investigation about what it means to be African American and how history impacts present day health and wealth and well-being.
Absolutely.
Well, maybe can you talk a little bit about what you found?
Let me tell that story first, so people, because I know people haven't read the book yet. But my father. So I start off the book talking. I set the scene where we were having a family gathering, and my father was there, and very happy to see all his grandchildren and children, getting along and so on. And just a couple of weeks later, he passed away from a heart attack. And so it's very, sudden. We didn't have any expectation. But once I started digging in, because, I'm a researcher, so my first instinct was to find out, well, why did my dad die from a heart attack, when he seemed so, vibrant and healthy. And so I started looking at the data and, went to the different websites, and I was like, wait a second, just being an African-American male puts you at higher risk for a heart attack. And so I realized, oh my gosh, this is something I had no idea about, really. I mean, you kind of have you hear these things, you may hear stories and articles, but, it didn't really hit me until I lost somebody. And, 5 years later, my mother had a stroke, and unfortunately she was incapacitated from that. And, she lived another 5 years, but it was, unfortunately, she was on a downhill slope from that point on. And I, again, became aware that stroke is another, just being African-American is a risk factor for stroke. And then it, hit me more directly when I always have this very strong memory of this, when I was driving around Berkeley one day and I was listening to NPR, and I heard this story talking about the fact that it didn't matter what your income level was, how educated you were. If you were a Black woman, you were more likely to have poor fetal and maternal outcomes than any other, race or and so it was just stunning to me. And, I was like, thank goodness, my boys were healthy, but, the studies show, so that's why I always bring in the research, because I can tell you my stories, but some people are going to respond better to seeing the actual data and the research. And so I found out that, and it's interesting because right after that, there was these New York Times stories, long articles about this situation. And there's been a lot more political and policy approaches taken to this issue, because it's crazy that in this day and age, Black women are still subject to poor outcomes. But then I realized it wasn't just, having dealt with my mother and father situations, it's not just, maternal outcomes, it's all kinds of health outcomes. So, I have a whole chapter that just talks about health and health outcomes. And this is an issue now because, of course, the vaccination situation. And, I heard another story on NPR. I listen to NPR all the time. So, but they were talking about the fact that, people are saying Black people are hesitant. And I even mentioned this in the book, that Black people are hesitant because of the, how they've been treated by the healthcare system. And it's not necessarily, people talk about the Tuskegee experiment. And if you don't know what that is, that was an experiment where going back, I think into the 20s or 30s, men who were infected with syphilis, Black men in the South who were infected with syphilis, weren't given treatment. They just monitored them until they died, basically. And it was a scandal because once they did have penicillin as a treatment, they didn't give these men the treatment. They followed them until they passed away. And so people talk about that, but the reality is probably, that's probably not what's motivating people. It's just the general fact that we know that when we go see the doctor, we're less likely to get treated well. We're less likely to get pain medicine. There's more recently, there was a doctor who had COVID and couldn't get her own hospital to treat her properly, and she ended up dying.
Yeah.
So there's all kinds of reasons why these things are important, but that's the, giving the facts as well as, personalizing it helps me to, it's first of all, to me being vulnerable. Right. And one of the things I'm trying to do is model vulnerability, because when we're vulnerable, it's just so much more impactful, and people can, and it also helps build trust.
Yeah. I mean, just the reasons. I mean, there, as you said, there are many reasons for it's black, and also Indigenous folks as well,
and
are really
Latino, Hispanic,
exactly, with COVID in particular, and when you go to the doctor and repeatedly you're not believed, and action is not taken. Distrust happens, right? And there's a lot. We can share some studies on that following the show too. There's a lot of research out there showing the inequities because of the biases in the system, in the medical system, in the healthcare system. So one of the things you also talk about is, and I think as part of this, is internalized depression. Part of that. Both willingness to be vulnerable and then becoming grounded in who you are and your experience.
Yes, absolutely.
And I think part of radical empathy, I think, right, is practicing it for ourselves. We in episode 8, Michael Thomas talks about how we as allies need to do our own work to heal. We all need to do our own work to heal so that we can be there for each other, and also so we don't cause harm to each other, because if we don't do that internal work to heal our own harm, we can also harm each other. And so can you talk a little bit more about internalized depression and how that works within this?
Yeah, absolutely. Because that's a really critical point. And it was something I really, the thing that I learned in doing this book is it's a lot of work. And so understanding internalized depression is not an easy thing to do, because you have to really be willing to open up to yourself. And so it's funny because I knew, as I was thinking about the book going out this week and out to the world, is, there's some trepidation because it's really me being vulnerable. Because one of the things I had to face was that, there was this component of my life growing up where I felt like, the way my parents dealt with other African American people made me feel like I shouldn't interact with other African Americans, and they kind of looked down on other African American families. And there's only a few families you would interact with, and we didn't even connect much with my mother's family in Los Angeles, or my father's family in Pittsburgh. And part of that was just, we were a huge family, and it wasn't easy to travel in those days. But also, I feel like I didn't really. So my action to help overcome this was to reach out to those family members and to start connecting with them. And also my siblings and I, we all really work hard. I mean, now we talk once a week via Zoom. But to come back to the internalized oppression component of it, is that it basically is this the idea that we live in structural racism. And so we all are impacted. And so we have internalized that oppression by, things like my parents, not interacting with other, so not only was I getting the message from the broader society that African Americans, were inferior and bad, but I was getting that message from my own parents.
Yeah.
And, and so I really had to acknowledge that and work past. And to be honest, during my 20s, I felt a lot of anger about that. I was very angry that I didn't have those connections to family members, that I had grown up kind of, isolated. And I talk about that, the isolation of internalized oppression. And yet, I have to have compassion for my parents, who are trying to do their best by us, right? They wanted us to be successful. And they, from their perspective, think about this in the 1960s, from their perspective, they felt that it was better for us to be assimilated into white society, to connect with, other people. And, I don't want to downplay, I had a good, childhood. I had lots of friends. I ran track and did all kinds of, activities and so on. So, the internalized oppression really, I think, impacted me more like after college, when I was trying to find my way. And the other problem is we tend to want to put, I mentioned this before, how we tend to put people in categories. And I felt, I call my 20s my years of cognitive dissonance, because I felt like people were always trying to, and I was trying to put myself, into those boxes, what it means to be Black, what it means to be educated, what it means to be a Stanford grad, all these different things where I felt like I had this tape going constantly in my head, where I was trying to figure out, who the heck am I? And so, by my late 20s, I feel like I finally figured out I just have to be who I am. And it's okay. I don't have to act the way these people over here want me to act. And I don't have to act the way these people over here. I'm just going to be myself. And that gave me the confidence to really move forward and just try to understand that, I have to make my own way in the world.
Awesome. So we're going to jump to questions in not too long. I'm sure you all have questions or thoughts or topics that you want us to kind of dive into. So I see a couple coming in already. So please do use the Q&A for questions. We also had an episode on episode 14. It was called "Moving from Structural Inequality to Human Flourishing" with Dr. Angel Acosta. He's amazing, and that was kind of what we can all do to heal, what that healing looks like, and it looks like something different for all of us. But I do think that there is some there's importance to this healing and to this kind of being vulnerable to recognize what's happening in yourself, what has happened over generations that might be, seeping into your own consciousness and your own kind of thoughts about who you are. Exactly. I know it has, even for me as, as a white woman, I've had to overcome so much. And I also spent my 20s really kind of like rethinking a lot and moving through past trauma and all of those things. And it's in order to really show up in the world. And so super important. I know that so a lot of folks are tuning into the show from outside the US, and there's definitely, a lot of things happening right now in the US around coming to terms with structural inequality and structural racism and even, now also there's a lot of racial violence against Asian people as well, and the model minority myth, that was the word I was thinking, the model minority myth in the Asian with the Asian community, and then also, I mean, there's just so much there.
Yeah, exactly.
That's happening in this really US centric and specific. Exactly. And I wonder, I know you're working a lot on transatlantic issues of race, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about some of the things that you're thinking about there, some of the ways that we can kind of broaden this conversation and broaden the understanding, because also, a lot of culture, global culture, there is a piece of American culture in global culture just because of our dominance in the world too. And I think that is important as well. A lot of the brands that we consume globally are produced here, and the culture that we consume globally is often produced here as well. So take the floor.
Oh yeah, no worries. There's a lot to pull together there. And it's funny because my research trajectory in terms of being a political scientist has been following along this path since the mid-90s. And although my first trip to France was in 1986 when I was still an undergrad at Stanford, and that was my first introduction to kind of some of the racialized issues that were happening in France. And if you've been reading the news lately, you'll see the French government isn't happy that American ideas about race are infiltrating the academy there. But this has been going on since the 80s, at least. I mean, this is a longstanding set of issues. And one of the more impactful things for me to understanding these issues was a 1995 movie called La Haine, in French, or Hate. And it talked about the story of three boys, one who's Russian immigrant, one who is from African background, and one who is from Arab background, and they're just a day in their lives, and they were being beat up by and it was a day where one of their friends had been killed was killed and eventually killed by the police. And so, it opened my eyes, and I would happen to be in France the summer that movie came out. And a lot of people in France just, they feel like France doesn't see race. And yet the reality is completely different. There's segregation, the police violence against people of color. And then the UK, of course, has a lot, basically all of Europe has these issues, even though they may not want to think of that way.
Most of the world does, yeah.
Yes, exactly. And we all, there's divides everywhere. But what strikes me is, and I am working on a book right now called The Roots of Racism, because I go back and look at, our ideas around race. And there's a lot of people who've been writing about this. Nell Painter has a great book on, basically how we got to the point of people being called white. And there's a lot of work that's going back to look at what happened in the 14 and 1500s. And it revolves around slavery and how we define people from Africa, and basically the commodification of human beings from Africa who are enslaved. And so that the ideas around race developed, around the 1500s to justify the slave trade that happened in 1617 and into the 1800s, right? Yeah. And so we have to understand, and my take on it is, if we don't understand the history, we can't understand where we are today. People want to just say, why can't we just stop talking about race and move on, and everybody just be happy? And we can't, because even as recently as World War II, and after the war, we had the GI Bill, and Black people didn't get it. But that's a little off topic. But to come back to the transatlantic issue, so the structural racism we are experiencing today came out of the slave trade, right? And the way that we basically had to dehumanize Africans to perpetuate the slave trade, and then after the end of slavery, at least in the US, we developed a whole series of laws that perpetuated the divides. And some of that did happen in the UK, although in the UK, really it got going more after World War II, when you'll hear the story of the Empire Windrush, which was the first a ship of immigrants coming from the Caribbean and to live. And there's been such a huge scandal over the years over the way these people were treated and not given their citizenship and so on. And so the UK has really had to come to terms with a lot of this. But France, they have slowly but surely been addressing issues of race, and it's been really difficult there. Germany, there's there's a conflation of immigration and race, and we see that here as well, because we tend to racialize people who we treat as inferior. And so that's happened with Latino Hispanic communities here. It's happened with Algerians in France. It's happened with Turks in Germany. I mean, obviously broader groups. I mean, you could spend a whole hour just talking about the situation of the Roma in Europe. But I think we have to, and I'm really pushing to develop a more transatlantic dialogue about this, because it's really critical to understand that where this comes from. This didn't just, come out of nowhere. It's been something that has, the 1619 Project was really great because, there may have been some historical inaccuracies in it, but the basic point is still valid, which is that, we've been dealing with this for over 400 years. And so, it's really critical that we keep in mind that this didn't happen yesterday. It happened a long time ago. And one of the things I've really been trying to do is, I did a book called Legislating Equality that talked about the development of the Racial Equality Directive in Europe and as part of the European Union. And that's been important because we have to understand how policy is or is not being implemented. And so it's important to take it from these, kind of the ideas of race and how that developed to the policies and how they are or are not being implemented, and then how the outcomes. So I talk about police violence in Europe and compare it to the US. I talk about housing segregation and how that compares in, across the Atlantic. And there's way too many similarities to say that, this doesn't come from, the history. But
well, the reality is that most of the ships came from Europe, right?
Exactly.
I mean, that's it is all connected. It's all connected. And I think we come to terms with it here because people were enslaved here and we have to. But I do think that it should be a more global conversation about, okay, well, really what happened and what is our collective responsibility?
Yeah. And Leva mentions, that she comes from a colonized country. That's a whole other component of it. And so I do spend a lot of time talking about colonialism because it did have a huge impact on, this idea of oppression and inferiority and so on. The French going to civilize, Africa, and the British going this, there's basically, the sun never sets on the British Empire. And yet, they did not treat these people like human beings when they came to the UK. And, Bridgerton be damned. It's a great idea, but I don't think
an idyllic look at the past.
Yes, indeed.
So how do you translate this into, where does empathy play the role here? How do you connect those two?
Right. So in terms of empathy, it's first of all, it's understanding the past and being able to see the connections. So it's empathy, but it's also intentionality and understanding the history and seeing how things from the past are impacting us today. So when you see a person, so if I'm in, the Netherlands and I see somebody from, Morocco or wherever they may be from, I need to understand that person's experience is not only what they've experienced in, say, the Netherlands today, but what their forebears experience. And so say in France, how people in Algeria experienced French colonialism and the horror of the war basically between France and Algeria, and what that means for today, and where these people live and why they live where they are. And so empathy in that sense is going beyond just what happened to this person today. You can't just put yourself in the shoes of that person today. You have to put yourself in their shoes in terms of understanding the broader history. So, I learned, one of the things I learned when I started digging into the family history, and this is some of the things that are starting to come to light now, is these, especially with the January 6th attack on the Capitol, is that mob violence has been a long-standing part of our history. And so I learned that in right after the Civil War in Opelousas, Louisiana, where my mother was born and raised, there was a huge massacre there of African Americans, and it was white people trying to keep African Americans from getting education and voting. And they say over 300 people were killed in it was the biggest massacre in Louisiana history. And so, and you hear all these different, these things happen on a regular basis, unfortunately, and people are massacred. And that's why, the whole voting rights issue, you have to have empathy for the fact that those of us who, know this history, who understand how we were kept from voting, since the Civil War, despite the constitutional amendments, you have to have empathy for the fact that we get upset when we see the January 6th, attacks, because we've lived through this over and over and over and over again. And it's all trying to discount our vote, right? Yeah. To discount our impact. I mean, that's why I was so traumatized by the January 6th attack on the Capitol, because it's like, oh my God, it's, history repeating itself.
Yeah.
So sorry, it's a very deep, but
no, I think it's important. Yeah, it's important.
Yeah, I mean, having empathy for, African Americans who are watching that means that you have to understand that this is, we have longstanding trauma over these kinds of events.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And I think, that other people from other identities as well, feeling similarly, people, well, Indigenous people, can you imagine?
Yeah, I know. For Indigenous people, I mean, the history is just so, hard.
Yeah. 500 years. Yeah. Okay. So, I'm going to jump to one question here, and then I do have another follow-up question there. So Yuka asks, do you distinguish between empathy, feeling what others do, versus compassion, recognizing the suffering of others and taking action? For me, I have to go beyond empathy to be able to unselfishly and unintentionally, to act unselfishly and unintentionally.
Yeah. I think compassion has a tendency to, like, I feel compassion for my parents, right? Because, they struggled, they, even though I'm angry at them for, some things they did when I was growing up, I obviously I love them, but, I also have compassion for their life experiences. But that, having compassion for them is different than me having empathy and actually trying to put myself in their shoes. So compassion to me is an extra step. Empathy is an extra step. It's easy. I mean, for me, compassion is something, you see people who are suffering and so on, but empathy is really trying to understand. Empathy is really about understanding and, being able to, or trying at least. And that's why stories are so important to empathy, because you have to be willing to listen and understand people's stories so that you can get to that point of empathy. You can't physically get into my shoes, but you can hear my stories and understand how I am, my life is being impacted by all these different things. But, for me, compassion is important too. I'm not saying we shouldn't have compassion. Absolutely, we should have compassion. But it's really, empathy is really work. It's really digging in and saying, I am going to do my best. And we can't always understand 100% somebody else's experiences. I don't want, and that's why we have to constantly practice. And, you have to get out and practice. And one of the things I really emphasize is you have to get outside of your comfort zone. And if you don't get outside of your comfort zone, it's easy to have compassion. It's not so easy to, have that discomfort. And this whole racial reckoning we're having in this country and transatlantically really is about getting out of our comfort zone. We have to sit in that discomfort And, that's what I had to do to write this book. I had to sit in my discomfort and say, this story is so important to tell that I have to be willing to be uncomfortable. And that's not easy to do.
Yeah. Yeah. I hear you. I just wrote a book as well, and it kind of went through the similar, some of those chapters are really difficult, but important. So you become vulnerable, become grounded in who you are, open yourself up to the experiences of others and really learn that history, understand that history. And then what does taking action look like?
Taking action is a broad range of things because we all have different capacities, right? So for me, taking action, was writing this book, but not everybody's going to write a book, and not everybody, I think the marching and so on is wonderful because it puts things on the agenda. But the question is, what happens after the march is over? And so we have to be willing to dig in. So, right now I'm working with the city of Menlo Park to hopefully start some action to create some task forces and really get us talking about things like, racial segregation, how the police are dealing with, different communities, education, so taking action can be everything from marching to, giving money to organizations, to reaching out and volunteering. I do a lot of volunteer work with different organizations. It can be trying to change policies, writing a letter to your congressperson. There's so much you can do. And actually, we have a reading guide that goes along with the book. So at the end of every chapter of the book, it's kind of a progression of actions you can take. And I want to make sure we talk about the last chapter, which talks about transitional justice and restorative justice, because to me, that's the ultimate. And I really wish the Biden-Harris administration would start a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, because we really need that in this country. And part of the reason we need a Truth and Reconciliation Commission is to deal with the facts, to really start addressing the issues that keep coming up. We keep repeating history because we haven't dealt with it. And so if we were to, and I don't believe that Truth and Reconciliation Commissions are the end all be all. I mean, South Africa has had mixed, it was a good thing, but it's had mixed results. Germany, I talk about, the situations in Germany after World War II and up to they're still reconciling with the history there. And the same with South Africa. But I do believe it is a great tool for giving people the opportunity to tell their stories, right? And so I do believe in the power of telling stories, but also having people, ask for forgiveness, for what crimes they may have committed. The thing, and I think the reason they went for this in South Africa is because they really wanted to make sure that the stories got out, that people understood the history. And it wasn't necessarily about punishing people. It was about really understanding and having a strong record of that history. And I visited South Africa, and I've seen, I've been to the museums and so on. It was really impactful for me. And I actually do a lot of research in Germany. So I spent a lot of time in Germany and seeing all the different relics of World War II and the Holocaust, and, even visiting the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. And again, that helped me build empathy for what happened in these countries and to these people. And so, I really think it's helpful for us to start thinking about how do we, get past, the divides and start reconciliation. And one of the things that's really interesting to me to see is, as the police and the FBI go after some of the people who attacked the Capitol, is a lot of them are kind of recanting and say, oh, I'm sorry for what I did. And I'm not saying they should, escape justice, but I do think we should have a process whereby they can tell their story and, if they want to ask for forgiveness. But I think that was one of the requirements of the South African Truth and Reconciliation process, is they had to acknowledge what they did.
Yeah. If you have more questions, we have time for maybe one or two. I see one just came in. I want to ask you about creating change and building trust, and particularly building trust. If you have any thoughts to share about how we build that trust with each other. The trust has been undone in so many different ways, right, over history. And a part of even advocating for each other is trust, right? Is the foundation of trust, and trusting each other to advocate for each other and all of that. So can you talk a little bit about trust?
Yeah, and trust really requires us to be honest. And so that's always been something that I have focused on, is, being transparent, honesty. But on the other side of that, it means we're willing to allow, my concern about, the current, cancel culture is that we aren't allowing people to apologize and to say they're sorry, or and obviously, if somebody's being insincere, just doing it for PR purposes, that's one thing, but we have to at least give people the opportunity to recognize past wrongs. And, that's the whole truth and reconciliation process. So we build trust by allowing people to hopefully be honest, and, to apologize. And, my goal in my life is to take people at their word. I believe most of us have a good heart. There's some people out there who don't, but for the most part, people have a good heart. And, I look at my neighborhood and I say, these aren't bad people. These are people who, I can trust, but I have to be honest with them. And so the honesty is really a two-sided thing. And I know, even for me personally, sometimes it's really hard for me to talk to people about ways I've been hurt, or because it's again coming back to being vulnerable. And I think we have a culture that looks down on vulnerability. And so our tendency is to, hide behind our walls and not want to be hurt. And that really makes it difficult to build trust. But on the other hand, we really need to develop that sense of, yes, you can trust, because, the trust factor is not just because we want to create change, it's because we want to allow people to be able to tell their truth and not feel like they're going to get beat up for it. And I think that's something I really had to work past, because I felt like, oh my God, if people know this about me or my story, I'm going to get all beat up. But the reality is, when I started opening up and, trusting people, they were very welcoming and open to hearing my stories, and trying to understand how I was experiencing, life growing up in a mostly white town, and things like that. So yeah, it's really means we all have to be a little more open to letting people make mistakes. And I know, Brene Brown really talks a lot about this. And I know there's some other speakers and writers who talk about the willingness to allow people to make mistakes is so critical to this process of reconciliation.
Yeah. And the allowing people to make mistakes, to hear what they've done that caused harm, and to be able to apologize, learn from it, and then do better. Yeah, that's how I agree completely.
Yes.
Verlance asked a question. If your org is very data driven in order to make changes, how do you encourage and motivate leadership to not just look at the numbers, but listen to employees' experiences? How do we get them to have this compassion and empathy, followed the compassion to feel it, followed by the empathy to understand, and followed by the actions to show they have seen, heard, and will do what's necessary?
So I'm a firm believer in coaching, and we have a couple of organizations here, including your own. And I'm doing a lot of this work now as well. And really, it's hard for people to work through this themselves. Actually, I'm getting ready to work with an organization that just, they tried to do this work themselves, and they realized, no, they needed some outside help. And it's okay to ask for outside help. And especially, it's important for the leadership to get some coaching on how to deal with these issues, because, we it's hard work. And if you don't have that outside help, it does tend, and I've seen this over and over again. A company will say, okay, we're going to get our numbers up. We're going to do this. We're going to make sure we have, more people of color, more, and women, especially here in Silicon Valley, women have to get more representation. But then this is why I start with saying we have to change ourselves first, because if the leadership says, oh, we're going to make all these changes, but they haven't confronted the structural racism and all of these things that are keeping them from being able to make those changes, then it's not going to happen. I used to point out, Intel as being one of the companies that really, put their money where their mouth is, in the sense of they gave incentives to managers to make sure they were hitting their goals. But were the managers really changing, and were they creating an environment that was welcoming? Because the data is going to do you any good if people, we saw what happened recently. Google is just a debacle right now with what happened there. And it's like, are you guys really doing the work to understand why people are horrified by all of this? Do you understand why your actions are hurting people and keeping people from wanting to work at your company? And, so one of the first steps I try to get people to do, besides, just looking inside themselves, is, what's your story? Why would somebody want to come and work with you? Explain to me why I would want to come and work in your company as a Black woman. How do you tell that story? And is it a story that makes me feel like I might belong or be included there? So, I think one of the things, Verlance, you can do is talk to ask your manager, your leadership. What story can they tell? Why would somebody want to work there? So yes, and I agree with the comment there that, that there's really a focus on statements and, numbers. And it's like, no, we have, and the work is hard. And I know, part of the reason, I go in, we just want the answers. We just want to do this now. It doesn't work that way. You have to start with yourself and understand why we've all been inculcated into this system that perpetuates sexism and racism.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is a process. You have to go deep. You have to do the work. You have to build that radical empathy. Verlance, also, I don't know if you saw or listened to episode 21, we talked about how to use empathy to create change in the workplace there. So we spent an hour talking with Kate Johnson from the CEO, the president of Microsoft USA about the work they are doing there and the work that she's doing around building empathy. So also take a look at that. All right.
Empathy is a great thing.
100%. 100%. So my question to you all is, what will you do to build radical empathy? What action will you take to really put some of this into place in you? And whether that's being vulnerable, becoming grounded in who you are, opening yourself up more to the experiences of others, practicing empathy, because it's more than just listening. It's showing and taking action, and then creating that change, building that trust. You do.
Yeah, and the last thing I would add is just that we all have power inside of us. And I think we tend to downplay that because, a lot of people say, oh, we need the leadership to do this. But when you're in an organization, or for me in higher ed, what I've seen is it's a bottom up and a top down thing. We have to demand, and I talk about this when I talk about inclusive leadership, is that what my point there is that we have to be demanding of our leaders to create this change.
Awesome. Yes. Special thanks to App Dynamics for their sponsorship of this episode. And I think Sally is going to put a link in the chat there to learn more about them. Also, thank you to Interpreter Now. And thank you everybody for tuning in to our show. Of course, this happens every week on Tuesdays. Please share the live events or the podcast at changecatalyst.co/allyship series. You can learn more. And also, if you wouldn't mind, if you have a moment, please share this and favorite, like it, review it on whatever platform you're on, subscribe to it, whatever platform you're on, that would really help us too. So appreciate you all. And Terri, thank you so much.
It's my absolute pleasure. Love you guys and love the work you do.
Yeah, likewise.
All right. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.